November 29th, 1944, 3:17 in the morning. A torpedo traveling at 46 knots punches through 70,000 tons of armored steel and detonates inside the largest warship ever built. Then a second, then a third, then a fourth. 4 explosions in less than 30 seconds. Superheated steam meets frozen seawater in the engine room, and the men on watch die before they can scream. Burning oil runs along the inside of the hull like blood through a vein. And on the bridge, the captain of the greatest secret weapon the Imperial Japanese Navy ever constructed grips the rail, watches his ship begin to die, and says nothing. Because there is nothing left to say. Here is what makes this night almost impossible to believe. The man who fired those torpedoes was considered finished, washed out. A commander so rattled by his own hesitation that he had walked into his superior's office and asked to be relieved of his own command. The United States Navy had essentially agreed with him. They had sent him to a desk at Midway and handed him a training assignment, the kind of posting given to men whose careers are politely over. His name was Joseph Enright. He was not a hero at the start of this story. He was a cautionary tale. And the ship he was about to sink did not officially exist. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built her in secret under a concrete roof inside a sealed shipyard where the workers were forbidden to leave, forbidden to write home, forbidden to speak her name. Not a single photograph of her construction survived the war. She was 900 feet of armored steel and political desperation commissioned in a ceremony nobody was allowed to watch, sent to sea before she was ready, because an empire with its back against the wall needed something to believe in. Her name was Shinano. She was the largest warship ever built. She would survive 17 hours at sea. This is the story of how a man the Navy had given up on found her in the dark, chased her for 6.5 hours at maximum speed, and put 6 torpedoes into her side before anyone on board knew what was happening. It is a story about patience and geometry and consequence. It is also a story about what happens when an empire cuts every possible corner and sends an unfinished ship into water that is full of hunters. To understand how that November night happened, you have to understand what the Pacific Ocean had become by the autumn of 1944. 3 years earlier, Japanese carriers had operated from Hawaii to Ceylon, setting the terms of every engagement. By late 1944, those carriers were gone. Akagi Kaga, Soryu Hiryu, all 4 lost in a single afternoon at Midway in June of 1942. Shokaku, gone at the Philippine Sea. Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, sent to the bottom at Leyte Gulf only weeks before our story begins. The numbers had become merciless. At Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, the largest naval battle in human history, Japan committed everything she had left. She lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers. The super battleship Musashi, sister to the legendary Yamato, was hammered apart by American aircraft over a single afternoon. What remained of the Imperial Navy limped back to home waters low on fuel, low on trained pilots running out of time. And American submarines prowled the coast. By late 1944, the Silent Service had become the most lethal instrument in the United States Navy. Submarines were sinking Japanese tankers, freighters, and warships faster than the Empire could replace them. The vast network of conquered territory that Japan had seized in the first year of the war was now being strangled not by invasion, but by attrition. Ton by ton, ship by ship, the Empire was running dry. This was the ocean Joseph Enright had been given a second chance to operate in. And the question hanging over him was brutally simple. Did he deserve that second chance? His failure had a name and a date. November of 1943. Enright was in command of USS Dace, his first wartime submarine command. He had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of moment. He had studied attack geometry until he could run the calculations in his sleep. He believed with the particular confidence of a man who has trained very hard for a long time that he was ready. On a moonlit night in the western Pacific, his lookout spotted a massive shape on the horizon. a Japanese fleet carrier, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, one of the most valuable targets in the Imperial Navy, moving within range of a man who had spent years learning exactly how to kill such a thing. The intercept was difficult. The angle was poor. The escorts were close. Enright hesitated. He made the cautious choice. He let her go. By morning, the carrier had vanished into the vastness of the ocean, and Enright understood with the particular sickness of someone who has missed something they cannot get back exactly what he had done. He had been handed the moment every submarine commander trains for, and he had flinched. He did something then that almost no officer does. He went to his superiors and requested to be relieved of his own command. He said in plain language that he had failed, that he could not trust his own judgment under pressure, that the Navy deserved a better captain than he had shown himself to be. His superiors accepted the request. He was sent to a desk at Midway. Training officer. The kind of assignment that politely ends careers. Most men stay in those assignments. Most men let the war end around them and go home and never talk about it. Enright spent a year trying to claw his way back. He asked for operational duty again. He requested another boat. He was refused repeatedly. Eventually, a senior officer who had watched Enright play poker in the officers' club at Midway, watched him push his chips into the center of the table without flinching, made a decision. He asked Enright one question: whether he would command a submarine the way he played cards. Enright's answer was a single word: yes. That word bought him USS Archerfish. 311 feet of fleet submarine, 4 diesel engines, 24 torpedoes, and a crew of 80-some men who had spent nearly a month at sea on their 5th war patrol without sinking a single ship. The pressure inside that boat was the quiet grinding kind. Not the seawater pressure, the other kind. On the night of November 28, 1944, Archerfish was on the surface south of Tokyo Bay charging her batteries. She had been assigned lifeguard duty. American B-29 bombers were supposed to hit Tokyo that night, and submarines were positioned along the return route to pick up any airmen who had to ditch in the sea. The raid was scrubbed due to weather over the target. The bombers never launched. That left Archerfish free to hunt. At 8:48 in the evening, the radar operator called down through the open hatch. Contact, bearing north. Range 12 miles. A pause. Then quieter. Big one. In the control room, men stopped moving. Enright came up the ladder fast. He took the binoculars from the lookout and steadied them against the rail. There was enough moon to make out shapes. Out where the radar said something was a dark mass sat against the horizon. Around it, smaller shapes moving. Escorts. He had no idea what he was looking at. He felt somewhere under his ribs that it was the most important thing he had ever seen. He turned to the bridge talker. His voice came out flat. Battle stations, surface attack. The general alarm moved through the boat in 3 short notes. Men moved without speaking. The forward torpedo room flooded its outer doors. The plotting party laid out fresh paper. Lieutenant Commander Bobzinski, the executive officer, bent over the chart with his grease pencil and began drawing lines. The geometry problem of his career had just walked into his sights, and he went to work on it with the methodical calm of a man who had been waiting for exactly this. And immediately the problem announced what it was going to cost them. The target was making 20 knots. Archerfish's maximum sustained surface speed was 19. A submarine cannot catch a faster ship. The faster ship pulls away. The geometry simply does not work. Enright stared at the plot for a long moment. He thought about what he had done a year ago when the geometry was difficult. He thought about a desk at Midway. He ordered all 4 diesels to full power and pointed Archerfish along an intercept course based not on where the target was, but on where it was going. He was betting on Japanese naval doctrine. Japanese warships threatened by submarines almost always zigzagged. Each change of course cost them speed over the ground. If the target turned even slightly, a submarine cutting the inside of that turn would gain ground. Enright did not need 20 knots. He needed patience and a target that would turn when the doctrine said it should. In the engine room, the temperature climbed past 120 degrees. The four diesels ran flat out, drinking fuel and breathing it back as a roar you could feel through the steel floor. Engineers worked in 20-minute shifts, came up the ladders pouring. Sweat gulped cold air, went back down. Spray broke over the bow. In the conning tower, Bobzinski kept marking the plot, kept updating the geometry, kept watching the numbers move in the direction he needed them to move. 90 miles to the north inside Shinano, something was already going wrong. The carrier had sailed from Yokosuka Naval Arsenal at 6 in the evening, with 3 destroyers as escort, heading southwest toward the safety of the inland sea at Kure. She was magnificent on the surface. 900 feet of armored flight deck, an island structure that rose like the wall of a building, a bow unlike anything in any recognition manual the United States Navy had ever published. She displaced 72,000 tons fully loaded. She was, by any physical measure, the largest warship ever sent to sea. She was also a ship that had never been properly finished. Her keel had been laid in 1940 as the third ship of the Yamato-class. A battleship of impossible scale, 18-inch guns and armor thick enough to shrug off anything the world could throw at her. Then Midway happened. 4 carriers lost in one afternoon. Japanese naval planners looked at the wreckage of their strategy and made a decision. The age of the battleship was over. Shinano, half-built and already carrying hundreds of tons of armor plating, would be converted into a carrier. The largest the world had ever seen. The conversion took years. The Navy wanted her at sea. By 1944, the reasons were no longer purely military. They were political. After Saipan, after the Marianas, after the slow cascade of disasters, the High Command needed something that proved the war was not yet lost. Shinano would be that symbol. The orders came down in writing. She would sail in November. No delays. The shipyard did what shipyards always do under impossible deadlines. They cut corners. The skilled welders had been drafted into the army. Their replacements were students and conscripts, and in some cases, prisoners of war. The standard X-ray inspection of critical welds was reduced to a visual check. The pressure testing of watertight bulkheads was rushed partial, and in some compartments, skipped entirely. Pumps were installed, but not tested under load. Drainage systems were approved on paper and never trialed in practice. Her captain, Toshio Abe, had walked her decks before sailing and written a formal memorandum to the naval staff cataloging every deficiency. Watertight doors that would not close properly. Pumps not yet wired. Half her boilers cold. Anti-aircraft mounts without ammunition. A crew assembled from survivors of previously sunk ships and rushed conscripts who barely knew each other's names, let alone their damage control stations. The response came back in one paragraph. Shinano would sail as scheduled. Abe folded the order and said nothing. He understood the political logic. He also understood, looking at his unfinished ship and his unready crew, that he was being asked to drive 72,000 tons of Imperial ambition through water that was thick with American submarines. And somewhere in those waters, a man was already running 4 engines at maximum power, watching a radar plot and refusing for the first time in his life to flinch. The 2 ships were moving toward each other through the dark. Neither captain knew what was about to happen. One of them was running out of time to find out. At 11 o'clock in the evening, a petty officer deep inside Shinano noticed the temperature gauge on the starboard inboard propeller shaft bearing climbing past its limits. He tapped the gauge. The needle kept rising. The bearing had been installed in haste with imprecise tolerances, and a lubrication system tested only once. Running at maximum revolutions, it was generating more heat than it could handle. The engineering officer felt the housing with his bare hand and pulled it away. He sent a runner to the bridge. Abe gave the order without changing expression. Reduce revolutions on the starboard inboard shaft. Shinano's speed fell from 20 knots to 18. In the conning tower of Archerfish, the sonar operator put his hand on his headphones. "Sir, her screws are slowing." Bobzinski looked at the plot and did the arithmetic in his head. A submarine that had been falling behind a faster ship was now suddenly faster than its target. He looked up at Enright. Enright closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he nodded once. The way a man nods when something he had only allowed himself to hope for has actually happened. The chase was his to win or lose, and Part 2 will show you exactly how close he came to losing it. Joseph Enright had spent a year earning back the right to sit in that conning tower. He had chased the largest warship ever built across 60 miles of dark Pacific Ocean on 4 screaming diesels. He had watched the geometry slowly, agonizingly shift in his favor when Shinano's bearing shaft overheated and dropped her speed 2 critical knots. And now, with Archerfish faster than her target for the first time all night, the question was no longer whether he could catch her. The question was whether the destroyers would find him first. And this is where the night nearly ended before it began. Because between Joseph Enright and the shot of his lifetime stood 3 Japanese destroyers running tired sonar equipment through cold November water, and one of them was already turning toward him. Isokaze had been running ahead of Shinano all night, half a mile off the carrier's starboard bow. Her lookouts had been staring into the dark for 6 hours. Cold men, tired men. The kind of men who past a certain point start seeing things in the water that may or may not be there. At 3 in the morning, one of those men saw something. A white feather of water 2,000 meters to starboard. A wake. Or what might have been a wake. Or what might have been the tip of a periscope cutting through the swell. He shouted. The destroyer's captain made a decision in under 5 seconds. He turned Isokaze hard to starboard, rang up flank speed and charged. He did not radio Shinano first. He did not wait for orders. He simply went. Isokaze's bow wave rose white in the moonlight as she accelerated through 30 knots. Her depth charge crews were already at their stations, opening the locking pins on the racks. In the sonar shack on Archerfish, the operator's voice came up the hatch tight and fast. High-speed screws. Bearing 340. Closing. Enright had seconds to decide. He could crash dive, take the submarine deep, survive the depth charges almost certainly, lose the target definitely. The chase would end here in the dark with a Japanese destroyer running over his head and the largest warship he had ever seen sliding away into the night. Forever. Or he could hold his depth, hold his nerve, and bet that Isokaze's damaged sonar could not get a firm fix on him in time. Take her down, he said. 150 feet. Rig for silent running. Rig for depth charge. The submarine tilted forward. Throughout the boat, hatches were dogged shut. Ventilation went off. Lights went red. 80 men became as silent as 80 men can be. Above them, Isokaze came on. Her screws beat the water directly overhead. The sound inside Archerfish was enormous. A thunder of cavitation. The high whine of turbines. The slap of a bow wave. Men in the control room looked up at the curved ceiling of the compartment as if they could see through the steel. No depth charges fell. Isokaze had lost the contact. She circled. She pinged. She found nothing. And then from the dark to the north, a signal lamp flashed. It was Shinano. Captain Abe had watched his lead destroyer break formation and charge off after what was probably nothing. He sent the order immediately. Return to station. Isokaze read the lamp. Her captain turned her hard back toward the carrier and resumed position. It was the correct decision by every rule of Imperial Navy doctrine. It was also the moment the war was lost. Because when Isokaze turned away, the patch of ocean she had been hunting opened up again, and the submarine she had not quite found rose back to periscope depth. It was 3:08 in the morning. The carrier was 2,800 yards off the port bow and closing. Enright pressed his eye against the periscope and looked at her for the first time from close range. He had spent 6 hours chasing a radar blip, a geometry problem, a hypothesis. Now he was looking at the thing itself. She filled the entire field of view. A flight deck like a cliff face. An island structure rising like the side of a building. A bow he did not recognize from any recognition manual the United States Navy had ever issued. Round and bulbous and strange, the kind of bow you design when you are building something the world has not seen before. He held the eyepiece for 10 seconds without speaking. Then he stepped back and said very quietly, downscope. Bobzinski looked up. Enright did not elaborate. He said only, "She's enormous." Then he raised the periscope again, read the bearing, read the range, and fed the numbers to the fire control party. The torpedo data computer, an analog machine of brass gears and mechanical logic, chewed on the geometry and produced a solution. At 3:17, Shinano steadied on her base course of 210 degrees southwest broadside to Archerfish, 1,400 yards away, 16 knots through the water. For a submarine commander, this is the textbook shot. The kind of solution you draw on a blackboard in training and tell the students they will probably never see in real life. Perfect angle, short range, steady target, no evasion. Enright thought about one more thing before he gave the order. An old piece of advice from a senior submariner he had served under early in the war. Hit them shallow. Do not try to punch through the bottom of the hull where the torpedo defense system is thickest. Hit them in the side near the waterline where the damage works against stability. He set the torpedo depth at 10 feet, unusually shallow. It would prove decisive. Final bearing and shoot, he said. Make ready all forward tubes. The forward room reported ready. He took one last look. The carrier was still there. She had no idea. Fire 1. The submarine shuddered as the first Mark 14 torpedo left its tube on a charge of compressed air. The weapon's propellers bit the water and it started its run at 46 knots. 8 seconds. Fire 2. 8 seconds. Fire 3. Fire 4. Fire 5. Fire 6. In less than a minute, 6 torpedoes were in the water. 6 warheads, each carrying 668 pounds of Torpex explosive, all of them tracking hot and straight and normal, toward 72,000 tons of unfinished steel. Enright put the periscope down and waited. Bobzinski counted the seconds out loud. Low, almost a whisper. 45, 50, 55. At 58 seconds, the first explosion. The column of white water rose higher than Shinano's flight deck. For a quarter of a second it hung there, and then the sound arrived low and enormous, felt through the hull of Archerfish as much as heard. The second torpedo hit 8 seconds later. The third, the fourth. 4 impacts in less than 30 seconds, all on the starboard side, between the bow and the island structure, all running at 10 feet exactly where Enright had aimed them. The 5th and 6th torpedoes ran past. Nobody on either ship would ever know for certain whether they missed by aim or by Shinano's slow attempt to turn. It did not matter. 4 was enough. The first warhead struck near frame 104 and tore open a hole 20 feet across, rupturing a fuel tank. The second hit frame 142, opening the starboard outboard engine room directly to the sea. The men on watch there died in seconds when cold seawater and superheated steam met at the same instant. The third torpedo struck frame 166. The number 3 fire room flooded immediately. The boiler failed catastrophically when cold water hit hot iron, and the men in that space did not survive in any way that left bodies to recover. The fourth hit at frame 190 ruptured another fuel tank and sent burning oil running along the inside of the hull like something alive. On the bridge, Captain Abe steadied himself against the rail as the ship shuddered 4 times in 30 seconds. He did not raise his voice. He did not change posture. He gave the orders the way he had always given orders. Damage report. Starboard list. Counterflood port side. Maintain course. He believed in that moment that his ship could absorb this. She had been designed to. Her armor belt was 8 inches thick at the waterline. She had been built to the same standard as Yamato, which had taken far more punishment than 4 torpedoes and kept fighting. The High Command had told him she was unsinkable under anything short of sustained air attack. He believed them. Below the waterline, what he believed was already being undone by what had actually been built. The armor itself held. The bulkheads behind it did not. Watertight doors that had never been tested under pressure either jammed shut trapping men in flooding compartments or refused to close at all, letting the sea pour through into spaces that should have stayed dry. Welds done by exhausted workers in poor light split under the new stress. Cable runs that should have been sealed at every bulkhead penetration leaked seawater 2 and 3 compartments away from the actual hits. The phenomenon naval engineers call progressive flooding, where a ship dies not from the wound itself, but from the inability to contain it, was already underway. The damage control parties did what they could. They were not enough. They had never drilled together as a complete crew. Some of them had been aboard for 3 weeks. Some for less. They did not all know their stations. When the counter-flood order came down, one party began letting water into the portside compartments to correct the starboard list. Another party, in a different section of the ship, did not know this was happening. They ran their pumps to clear what they believed was unauthorized flooding. They emptied the very compartments the first party was trying to fill. The two efforts canceled each other out. The list got worse anyway. 5 degrees, then 7, then 10. Miles to the south, Enright had taken Archerfish deep and was riding out the counterattack. 14 depth charges, none close. The destroyers were not really hunting him. They were running back to their ship. When he finally brought Archerfish up to periscope depth at dawn, the horizon was empty. He did not know what had happened. He transmitted his contact report and turned south toward base. The message he sent was precise. 1 carrier. Flight deck approximately 800 feet. Bow configuration unidentified. Estimated displacement 28,000 tons. 4 torpedo hits observed. Target last seen with heavy starboard list. That message would travel to Pearl Harbor, pass through the hands of naval intelligence analysts, and be quietly filed as probably exaggerated. There was no carrier in the Japanese order of battle matching that description. There could not be. They would credit Enright with a hit on a carrier of indeterminate and probably smaller type. They would give him the Navy Cross with a citation that mentioned an enemy aircraft carrier without specifying which one, because the United States Navy was not yet willing to put on paper what it could not verify. 17 hours after leaving Yokosuka, Shinano rolled past vertical, showed her barnacled red-painted hull to the pale morning sky for one long moment, and went under. She took Captain Toshio Abe and 1,434 men with her. The 1,080 survivors were pulled from freezing water covered in fuel oil, ordered to silence, and disappeared into the machinery of Imperial Secrecy. To the Japanese public, she had never existed. To the families of the dead, there was only the standard notification. Killed in action. Place not specified. But beneath 4,000 meters of water off Cape Omazaki, the largest warship ever built was settling onto the seafloor upside down. Her armored flight deck, the one she had never used to launch a single aircraft, was pressing into soft Pacific sediment. And in Part 3, we will discover exactly how long the Empire managed to keep her secret, what the men who survived carried with them for the rest of their lives, and why the officer who sank her was still being doubted by his own Navy even after the war was over. Joseph Enright fired 6 torpedoes into the dark and sank the largest warship ever built. 4 hits. 17 hours at sea. 1 submarine. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost 1,434 men, and their greatest secret in a single November night. But when Enright's patrol report reached Pearl Harbor, naval intelligence read it and filed it under probably exaggerated. There was no such ship. There could not be. And now, thousands of miles away in Tokyo, something far more dangerous than American skepticism was beginning to happen. The Imperial Navy had lost Shinano, and they needed to make sure nobody ever found out why. In the first week of December 1944, a meeting took place inside the Naval General Staff headquarters in Tokyo that was not recorded in any official log. The men who attended it had just absorbed the loss of 72,000 tons of steel, the largest single warship expenditure in Japanese naval history, to a single American submarine on the ship's first night at sea. The fury in that room was not the loud kind. It was the cold, precise kind that comes when men who have staked their professional survival on a symbol watch that symbol go straight to the bottom of the ocean in 17 hours. The surviving officers from Shinano's escort had already been debriefed and isolated. Their accounts were sealed. The 1,080 survivors pulled from the water were dispersed to separate postings across the empire and ordered under direct naval authority not to discuss the ship. her name, her mission, or her fate with anyone. Not their families, not their fellow sailors, not their commanding officers at their new posts. The standard death notification was sent to the families of the 1,434 men who did not survive, killed in action, place not specified. To the Japanese public, Shinano had never existed. To the rest of the Imperial Navy, she had never sailed. The cover held with remarkable efficiency for a bureaucracy that was simultaneously losing a war on 6 fronts, because the men who had built her, sailed her, and watched her go under, understood implicitly that her loss was not just a military catastrophe. It was a confession. It was proof that the Empire had rushed an unfinished ship into combat waters because political desperation had overridden every professional judgment about readiness. Nobody in the Naval General Staff wanted that confession on paper, but the Americans were not unaware that something had happened. Enright's report had described a carrier of unprecedented dimensions. Even discounted by skeptical intelligence analysts, it sat in a file at Pearl Harbor like an unanswered question. Submarine commanders in the waters south of Japan were quietly tasked with increased surveillance of shipping lanes out of Yokosuka. The Navy did not know what Archerfish had sunk. They knew something significant had gone down in those waters on November 29th, and they intended to find out what. Meanwhile, the Imperial Navy was confronting a problem that Shinano's loss had made catastrophic. She had not been designed purely as a combat carrier. Her secondary mission, the one that made her strategically irreplaceable in late 1944, was to serve as a mobile repair and resupply platform for the remaining carrier air groups still operating out of home waters. With the fleet carriers gone and the trained pilot pool effectively destroyed at the Philippine Sea, Japan's surviving naval air power depended on a logistical infrastructure that Shinano was supposed to anchor. Without her, that infrastructure had a hole in it that nothing else in the Imperial inventory could fill. The Naval General Staff began emergency planning for alternatives. None of them were adequate. Conversion of existing hulls would take months the Empire did not have. Requisitioning of civilian vessels would expose the gap to foreign observers and domestic press. The options narrowed quickly to the same answer every Japanese strategic planning session was arriving at by late 1944. Hold, defend. Wait for the Americans to bleed themselves against prepared positions and sue for terms. It was not a strategy, it was a prayer. But the internal crisis that mattered most in the weeks after Shinano's sinking was not in Tokyo. It was in the offices of Pacific Fleet Intelligence at Pearl Harbor, where a specific question was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. If Enright had actually sunk something as large as he described, and if that something had sailed from Yokosuka on November 28th and vanished from all observable Japanese naval activity thereafter, then American intelligence had experienced a complete failure to detect the construction, commissioning, and deployment of the largest warship in history. In their own operational theater, that was not a small problem. The analysts who had reduced Enright's claim knew what was at stake professionally if they reversed themselves. They had written their assessments. Those assessments had been distributed. Reversing them now would require acknowledging that a submarine commander they had doubted had been correct, and that the entire intelligence apparatus tracking Japanese naval construction had missed something the size of 3 football fields being built under a concrete roof in a shipyard they were actively monitoring. The bureaucratic incentive to maintain the original assessment was significant, so it held. Enright received his Navy Cross. The citation mentioned an enemy carrier without specifying type or tonnage. The men of Archerfish celebrated a kill that their own Navy would not officially quantify. And in the lower engineering spaces of Japanese naval facilities across the home islands, workers who had spent 2 years building Shinano under a concrete roof went back to other assignments and said nothing to anyone because the men who had given them those instructions were still in power and the war was still going on. Then, in the winter of 1945, American submarine operations in Japanese home waters entered a new phase. The campaign that had been bleeding Japanese logistics for 3 years was now operating with increasing confidence inside ranges that had previously been considered prohibitively dangerous. Submarines were penetrating the Bungo Strait, entering the Sea of Japan itself, operating in waters where the Imperial Navy had once felt entirely safe. The intelligence gaps that had allowed Shinano to be built in secret were now working against Japan as American commanders operated in Japanese coastal waters, with a freedom of movement that Tokyo had not anticipated and could not counter. On the morning of June 9, 1945, USS Skate and USS Bonefish were operating in the Sea of Japan as part of a 9-submarine wolf pack designated Operation Barney. This was the first sustained American submarine penetration of the Sea of Japan, a body of water Japan had considered an interior lake beyond the reach of any threat. It was not beyond the reach of this threat. The submarines had entered through the La Perouse Strait in the north, running deep through minefields that American engineers had spent months calculating safe paths through, and they were now hunting in waters where Japanese shipping had moved without escort or fear for the entire war. In 4 days of operation, the Wolfpack sank 28 Japanese ships. 28 vessels that had been moving through the Sea of Japan without meaningful defensive escort, because nobody in Tokyo had prepared for the possibility that American submarines would be there. Freighters, tankers, troop transports, gone. The total tonnage destroyed exceeded 57,000 tons. The loss of merchant shipping in those 4 days accelerated the starvation of Japanese home islands that was already proceeding through the submarine campaign against Pacific supply lines. Bonefish did not return from Operation Barney. She was lost with all hands on June 18th, the only American submarine lost in the operation. 80 men. Her captain, Lawrence Edge, had been in the same training program as several officers serving on boats in the same wolf pack. The loss was absorbed with the particular silence of submarine culture, the acknowledgement that in this kind of warfare, the arithmetic was brutal and the accounting was paid in whole crews. The surviving 8 submarines returned through the Tsugaru Strait on June 24th. The operational results were distributed through Fleet Command as evidence that Japanese home waters were no longer safe at any depth or in any sea. The psychological impact on Japanese naval planning was significant precisely because the Sea of Japan had represented a psychological boundary as much as a strategic one. When that boundary failed, when the interior lake became a hunting ground, the calculus of defense shifted in ways that planners in Tokyo had not prepared contingencies for. The news did not reach the Japanese public. The press continued to report naval engagements in terms chosen to obscure the scale of losses. But within the naval staff, the 28 ships lost in 4 days, in what should have been safe water, produced a response that was essentially despair given administrative form. Orders were revised. Shipping routes were altered. Escorts were assigned to convoys that had previously moved without them, which meant pulling those escorts from other duties which degraded other defensive capabilities. Every response to the submarine campaign created a new vulnerability somewhere else in a system that had too few assets to cover all its obligations. Meanwhile, in Pearl Harbor, the file on Archer Fish's November patrol sat unchanged. Enright had returned to sea on subsequent patrols. He had not sunk another ship of comparable significance. He was a competent and respected commander by the standards of the submarine service, which were demanding standards. But the question of what he had actually sunk on November 29, 1944, remained officially unresolved. The Navy had credited him with a hit. It had not credited him with what he had actually done, because what he had actually done was not yet verified, and verification required evidence that was sitting in sealed archives in a country that was still at war. The war ended on September 2, 1945. Japanese naval archives opened to American investigation teams in the weeks that followed. The teams worked methodically through construction records, commissioning documents, loss reports, the administrative sediment of a Navy that had kept meticulous records even while losing catastrophically. And in those records, they found her. Shinano. Displacement 71,000. 890 tons fully loaded. Keel laid May 1940. Commissioned November 19, 1944. Lost November 29, 1944. Lost to submarine attack. In one document, a clerk had typed the designation of the responsible vessel: USS Archerfish. The record was forwarded to Naval Intelligence. It landed on the desk of at least one analyst who had signed his name to an assessment describing Enright's claimed target as probably smaller than reported. What happened in those offices when the verification arrived is not recorded in any document that has been made public. What is recorded is the outcome. Archerfish was officially credited with the sinking of Shinano, largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. A record that has never been broken by any navy in any conflict since. Enright was notified through proper channels. His response by the account of officers who were present was characteristically brief. He said something to the effect that he was glad the paperwork had finally caught up. Then he went back to whatever he was doing. But the full story of what Shinano represented, what her loss meant, not just militarily, but as a diagnosis of the empire that built her, and what became of the men who survived her, and what became of Joseph Enright himself in the decades that followed, that story had one more chapter that almost nobody who watched the war unfold ever learned. The man who sank the largest warship in history spent the rest of his career in a navy that would rather have credited the torpedoes than the judgment behind them. And in Part 4, we will find out what he did with that, and what the sea finally gave back when a research vessel found Shinano on the bottom in 2017, upside down, exactly where she had landed on the morning she went under, still keeping her secrets in 4,000 meters of dark water. Joseph Enright fired 6 torpedoes on a November night in 1944 and sank the largest warship ever built. He chased her for 6.5 hours across 60 miles of dark Pacific Ocean. He survived 14 depth charges. He filed a patrol report that his own intelligence service refused to believe. He received a Navy Cross with a citation that carefully avoided specifying what he had actually sunk. And then, in the way that wars have of consuming the extraordinary and moving on the Navy, asked him to keep doing his job. But the story of what happened to that man after the guns went silent is the part that almost nobody tells. Because the twist at the end of this story is not about the ship. It is about what success costs a man who the institution never quite forgave for being right. Joseph Enright continued to serve in the Pacific through the end of the war. He did not sink another ship of comparable significance. The submarine campaign continued without him at its center. Other commanders, other boats, other patrols, accumulating tonnage and decorations, while Archerfish ran her remaining war patrols without adding substantially to her score. By the standards the Navy used to measure submarine commanders, Enright was competent, not exceptional. The fleet boat captains who sank the most tonnage were the ones the histories would remember by name. Enright had sunk one ship. One enormous, secret, unprecedented ship, but the Navy's accounting system did not yet know how to weight it. When the war ended in September 1945, he returned to the United States as thousands of officers did, carrying a record that was simultaneously extraordinary and officially unremarkable. He stayed in the Navy. He served through the post-war reorganization, through the establishment of the unified command structure, through the early years of the Cold War, when submarine doctrine was being rewritten around the nuclear threat. He advanced in rank with the measured pace of a competent career officer. He was not celebrated. He was not lionized. He attended the ceremonies that officers attend and filed the reports that officers file, and did not speak much about November 29, 1944, because there was not yet an official framework for speaking about it accurately. The verification from Japanese archives arrived in late 1945, and the credit was officially adjusted. USS Archerfish, Shinano, 71,890 tons, largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. The Navy processed this information with bureaucratic correctness and moved on to other matters. There was no ceremony specifically for that revision. No second medal. No public acknowledgement proportional to what the record actually represented. The citation that had carefully avoided naming the ship was not reissued with the name added. The Navy Cross remained as it had been written a recognition of an action against an enemy carrier of unspecified type. Enright retired from the United States Navy in 1965 after more than 2 decades of post-war service. He went home to a life that by his own later account suited him. He did not write a memoir. He did not pursue speaking engagements. When naval historians began seriously researching the Pacific submarine campaign in the 1970s and 1980s, he gave interviews that were factual and brief. He described the chase with the economy of a man who had replayed it enough times that the drama had been worn smooth. The torpedoes worked. They were lucky. The target turned when the doctrine said it would. The bearing shaft overheated at the right moment. He mentioned the rosary occasionally, not dramatically. He died in 2000. He was 83 years old. The obituaries noted his role in sinking Shinano. Several of them got the tonnage wrong, but his real legacy, the one that outlasted the medal and the adjusted citation and the quiet retirement, was not about him personally at all. It was about what the night of November 29, 1944, demonstrated at a cost of 6 torpedoes and 6.5 hours of maximum engine power. The Pacific submarine campaign as a whole is one of the most consequential and least celebrated military operations in American history. By the end of the war, American submarines had sunk 1,314 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 5.3 million tons of shipping, plus 201 warships. They had done this with less than 2% of total United States Navy personnel. The silent service absorbed roughly 3,500 killed in action, the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American armed forces. In exchange, it effectively strangled the Japanese war economy. By the summer of 1945, Japanese industrial production had fallen to less than a third of its 1942 peak. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Steel shortages halted shipbuilding. Food shortages were producing measurable malnutrition in the civilian population of the home islands. The submarines did not win the war alone. But the case can be made that without them, the war would have lasted years longer and cost hundreds of thousands more lives on both sides. Shinano's sinking sits inside that campaign as its single most dramatic data point. Not because the ship was the most strategically significant target the submarines ever hit, but because of what the circumstances required. Enright did not have a faster boat. He did not have better torpedoes. He did not have intelligence support that identified the target before he found her on radar. He had 6.5 hours of patience, an executive officer with a gift for geometry, 4 screaming diesel engines running at temperatures that required 20-minute crew rotations, and the capacity to make a correct bet on Japanese doctrine, when every alternative bet would have lost him the shot. The technology that made it possible was not exotic. The Mark 14 torpedo, which had spent much of the early war plagued by a defective exploder mechanism that caused fully a third of them to fail on contact, had by late 1944 been corrected through the combined pressure of furious submarine commanders and eventual Bureau of Ordnance accountability. Enright's 6 torpedoes performed as designed because other commanders before him had complained loudly enough and long enough that the defect was finally fixed. That correction applied across the entire submarine fleet increased effective hit rates by an estimated 40% in the final 18 months of the war. 40% more of every salvo actually exploding. The arithmetic of that improvement runs into thousands of tons of additional shipping. Sunk dozens of additional warships lost an acceleration of the logistics collapse that was squeezing Japan to surrender. The shallow depth setting Enright chose 10 feet instead of the standard deeper setting reflected a tactical lesson that had been circulating through the submarine community for months. Hit carriers in the side near the waterline. Let the sea do the work that the warhead begins. That insight derived from accumulated combat experience and shared informally through the culture of the submarine service, rather than through any formal doctrine update, proved decisive against a ship that had been designed to resist exactly the kind of damage she received. Shinano's armor belt held. Her bulkheads failed. The 10-foot setting meant the torpedo struck above the thickest torpedo defense and opened the hull to progressive flooding in compartments that had never been properly sealed. The lesson traveled. Submarine commanders in subsequent patrols applied variations of the same approach to whatever targets they found. The informal knowledge network of the Silent Service, built around patrol debriefs and officer mess conversations, and the simple fact that the submarine community was small enough that most commanders knew each other personally, transmitted tactical learning faster than any official doctrine channel. It was adaptive and human, and it worked. That model of informal institutional learning is now studied in military education programs as an example of how combat organizations actually evolve doctrine under pressure. The textbooks use different examples. The underlying mechanism is the same one that let Joseph Enright in Enright make a correct tactical decision at 3 in the morning after 6.5 hours of pursuit because someone he had served with earlier in the war had told him something useful at dinner. Now for the detail that most accounts of this story leave out entirely. In 2017, a research vessel called Petrel, funded by the late Paul Allen, located Shinano on the seafloor off Cape Omazaki in approximately 4,000 meters of water. The images came back slowly through the deep-sea camera systems. She was upside down. She had landed that way on the morning she went under, and she had stayed that way for 73 years. The flight deck she never used pressed into soft Pacific sediment, her armored belt visible in the darkness to cameras mounted on a remotely operated vehicle. The largest warship ever sunk by a submarine found exactly where the geometry of her sinking said she would be. The research team documented what the cameras showed. The hull was largely intact at that depth. The armored belt had not failed exactly as Enright's shallow-set torpedoes had anticipated. The structural damage from the 4 torpedo strikes was visible on the starboard side. 4 distinct wounds between the bow and the island position, each one consistent with the Mark 14 running at 10 feet. The hull had done what it was designed to do. The bulkheads behind it had done what the rushed construction had made inevitable. What the cameras also showed, and what the research team noted without elaboration in their documentation, was the flight deck surface itself. Buried in sediment, undisturbed for 7 decades, it still showed the painted markings for aircraft positioning the guides and lines for a flight operations tempo that Shinano never conducted. She had gone to the bottom ready in that narrow sense to do the thing she was built to do. She simply never had the chance. The discovery was covered in naval history publications and in the general press with the particular brevity reserved for things that happened a long time ago and do not involve living participants. Paul Allen, who funded similar expeditions that found Musashi Indianapolis and several other significant Pacific War wrecks, died in October 2018. The Petrel project continued under other direction. The images of Shinano on the seafloor are publicly available. Most people who watch them do not know what they are looking at, which is the final resting place of a ship that the United States Navy spent several months officially refusing to confirm existed. Joseph Enright never learned that the ship had been found on the bottom. He had been dead for 17 years by the time the cameras went down to look at her. But in a way that the archives make quietly clear, he knew where she was. He had put her there. He had filed the report. He had provided the coordinates and the time and the number of hits and the approximate dimensions of the flight deck as seen through a periscope at 1,400 yards on a November night. He had been correct about all of it. The Navy eventually confirmed every detail he had reported. It just took them 60 years and a research vessel funded by a technology billionaire to finish the job. From a submarine commander who had asked to be relieved of his own command for hesitating to, the man who chased the largest warship in history for 6.5 hours and put 4 torpedoes into her side with a targeting solution that naval training programs still use as a textbook example. Joseph Enright's story is finally at its core a story about what patience and willingness to be wrong about yourself can produce when the moment actually arrives. He sank a ship that did not officially exist with torpedoes that worked because other men before him had complained loudly enough to get them fixed, using a depth setting derived from informal knowledge shared over dinners between patrols, after a chase made possible by a bearing shaft that overheated on an unfinished ship sent to sea too soon by an empire that needed a symbol more than it needed a warship. The largest predator. The largest prey. 6 hours of geometry and 1 correct bet on doctrine. If you know a story like this one, a decision that should not have worked, a man who should not have been there a night that should have gone differently, leave it in the comments. These are the stories that the official histories file under indeterminate type, probably smaller than reported. And those are precisely the stories worth getting right. The sea remembers everything. The question is whether we are paying enough attention to hear what it is saying.